You'll never amount to anything. What a worthless disappointment you are." My mother's words cut through the elegant reception hall, silencing nearby conversations as my sister's wedding guests pretended not to hear. 1 week later, her name flashed on my phone screen with a desperate voicemail. "Sweetie, I need your help. The bank is taking everything." It's funny how quickly worthless transforms into valuable when someone needs a financial bailout. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The invitation to my sister Vanessa's wedding sat on my kitchen counter for 3 months before I finally checked the attending box. It wasn't that I didn't want to celebrate her happiness. I genuinely did. But family gatherings in the Morgan household had always been emotional minefields, with my mother, Diane, strategically placing explosives beneath polite conversation, waiting for the perfect moment to detonate them. "You have to go," my best friend Zoe insisted over coffee a month before the event. "If you don't, you'll regret it, and your mother will use it against you forever." She wasn't wrong. In the Morgan family narrative, I was already cast as the difficult daughter, the one who moved 5 states away, who chose a man's career in financial consulting, who remained unmarried at 35, and whose Christmas gifts were always deemed slightly inadequate. Skipping my only sister's wedding would cement my villain status permanently. So there I was on a perfect June Saturday, dressed in a carefully selected navy blue dress that had cost more than my monthly car payment, sitting in the 3rd row of an elegant garden ceremony. The weather seemed to conspire with my sister's. Meticulous planning, 75 degrees, slight breeze, strategically placed clouds providing occasional relief from the sun without threatening rain. "Doesn't Vanessa look beautiful?" whispered an elderly aunt whose name I couldn't quite recall. Nodded in genuine agreement. My younger sister was radiant in a classic white gown, her dark hair swept up with tiny white flowers woven through the intricate style. Beside her, Thomas, a pediatric surgeon with kind eyes and a slightly crooked smile, looked at her with undisguised adoration. They were well matched in every way that mattered, both caring, intelligent, and dedicated to their careers while prioritizing family. The ceremony was mercifully brief, with personalized vows that managed to be both sincere and concise. As Vanessa and Thomas sealed their union with a kiss, I felt a genuine surge of happiness for my sister. Perhaps, I thought naively, the day would continue in this spirit of joy and celebration. The reception was held at the Bellamy Estate, a restored 19th-century mansion with sprawling gardens and a grand ballroom that balanced historic charm with modern amenities. I'd been seated at table 7, not quite the family table, but not exiled to the periphery either. A diplomatic compromise that seemed to acknowledge both my familial importance and my outsider status. I was midway through an impressively prepared salmon entree when my mother appeared beside me, champagne glass in hand. At 62, Diane Morgan maintained the same impeccable appearance that had been her armor throughout my childhood. Designer. Dress in a flattering shade of mauve, perfect makeup that concealed rather than accentuated her age, jewelry that signaled affluence without ostentation. "Rachel, darling," she said, resting her free hand on my bare shoulder. Her fingers were cool against my skin, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the light. "Come join me for a moment. There's someone I'd like you to meet." I excused myself from the table, where I'd been engaged in pleasant small talk with Thomas's cousins, and followed my mother to a quieter corner of the ballroom. The someone turned out to be Martin Schaefer, a divorce attorney approximately 15 years my senior, with thinning hair and a confident smile that displayed expensive dental work. "Martin is a longtime friend of Thomas's family," my mother explained, her voice carrying the particular tone she reserved for matchmaking attempts. "He has his own practice in Greenwich." "Lovely to meet you," I said automatically, extending my hand. "The pleasure is mine," Martin replied, holding my hand slightly longer than necessary. Your mother tells me you're in finance? Financial consulting, I clarified. I specialize in reorganization strategies for mid-sized companies facing potential bankruptcy. How fascinating, he said, in a tone that communicated the opposite. I imagine that keeps you quite busy. It does, I agreed. I just finished a major project in Detroit last month, completely restructuring a manufacturing firm's debt and operations. We saved over 300 jobs. My mother's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Rachel has always been very career-focused, she said, as if apologizing for a regrettable character flaw. Sometimes at the expense of other priorities. I recognized the familiar strategy, the subtle undermining wrapped in superficial praise. Throughout my childhood and adult life, my mother had perfected the art of diminishing my achievements while appearing to celebrate them. Each academic honor, professional advancement, or personal milestone was acknowledged and then immediately devalued through careful comparison or contextual reframing. Actually, I said, choosing my words carefully, my firm just made me the youngest partner in their 20-year history. The announcement goes public next week. This was news I'd been saving for after the wedding, not wanting to distract from Vanessa's moment. But my mother's setup had triggered an old defensive reflex. The partnership represented not just professional validation, but financial security beyond anything my parents had ever achieved. My annual compensation would now exceed their combined lifetime earnings, a fact I took no pleasure in but which provided a shield against their persistent disapproval. Martin seemed genuinely impressed. Congratulations! That's quite an achievement. My mother's expression flickered between surprise and something darker. A partner? Well, I suppose that will make it even harder for you to focus on starting. A family. You're not getting any younger, Rachel. Mom, I said quietly. Today is about Vanessa and Thomas. Let's keep it that way. But Diane Morgan had never been one to relinquish control of a conversation once she'd set its direction. I'm only thinking of your happiness, darling. Success is wonderful, but what good is an empty house and no one to share it with? Look how happy your sister is. I am happy, Mom. My life just looks different from what you imagined for me. Different, she repeated, swirling the champagne in her glass. Yes, you've always insisted on being different. Ever since you were a child. Refusing to wear the dresses I bought you, choosing those science camps over dance lessons, always the contrary one. Martin shifted uncomfortably, belatedly recognizing he'd been drafted into a family dynamic that preceded him. I should probably check in with the Hendersons, he said. We're discussing a potential vacation property. Very nice meeting you, Rachel. Congratulations again on the partnership. As he retreated, my mother's veneer of social politeness evaporated. You couldn't just play along, could you? Martin is considered quite a catch in Greenwich. Susan Kellerman has been trying to set him up with her daughter for months. I'm not interested in being caught, Mom, and I'm certainly not moving to Greenwich to become a trophy wife for a divorce attorney. No, you'd rather bury yourself in spreadsheets and board meetings. Such a waste. She finished her champagne in one elegant swallow. Your father and I gave you every advantage, every opportunity. Do you know what I could have done with the education you received? This was familiar territory. My mother's parallel life narrative, the brilliant career she might have had if not for the sacrifices of motherhood. The implied accusation that my success was both an obligation from her, sacrifice, and a rebuke of her choices. I'm grateful for everything you and Dad provided, I said, the rehearsed response of decades. You made it possible for me to build the life I have. The life you have, she repeated, her voice taking on the slightly theatrical quality that signaled an escalating confrontation. Alone in that sterile apartment in Chicago, working 60-hour weeks with no one to come home to. Is that really what you want to celebrate? I glanced around, becoming aware that several nearby guests were studiously pretending not to overhear our conversation. "This isn't the time or place, Mom." "It never is with you. Always deflecting, always too busy, always running away from any real conversation about your life choices." I took a deep breath, trying to maintain the peace for Vanessa's sake. "I'm going to get some air. We can talk another time." I had turned to leave when she caught my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "That's right. Walk away. That's what you do best, isn't it? Run back to your precious career and your empty life. You know what breaks my heart? Watching Vanessa achieve everything a mother dreams of while you just waste your potential." Something in me snapped. A tension wire that had been stretched, taut for 35 years, finally breaking under one pressure point too many. What exactly am I wasting, Mom? My Harvard MBA? My 6-figure income? My professional reputation? Or just my potential to fulfill your particular vision of womanhood? Her eyes widened, unused to direct confrontation from me. Another buzz. "Your mother is a psychological terrorist. Remember that none of what she said is true." I didn't respond to that one, unsure in that moment what was true and what wasn't. My mother's words had found their target with sniper precision, because they exploited my own private doubts. The 3 a.m. questions about choices made and paths not taken, the occasional hollow feeling when witnessing others' family milestones, the uncertainty about whether professional accomplishment alone would sustain me through the decades ahead. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted my thoughts. I looked up, expecting my father, sent as an emissary by my mother to manage the situation. Instead, I saw Vanessa, her wedding gown gathered carefully in one hand as she navigated the garden path. "You shouldn't be out here," I said as she approached. "It's your reception." Vanessa sat beside me on the bench, arranging her dress with practiced movements. "It's my wedding, which means I get to decide where I should be." She studied my face in the dim light. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," I said automatically. "I'm sorry about what happened in there. I never meant to create a scene at your wedding." Vanessa shook her head. "You didn't create anything. Mom did what Mom always does. She pushed and pushed until she got the reaction she wanted, and then acted shocked when it happened." Her assessment surprised me. Vanessa had always been the peacekeeper in our family, the one who smoothed ruffled feathers and found diplomatic compromises. I'd never heard her speak so directly about our mother's manipulative tendencies. "Still," I said, "it's your special day. You shouldn't have to deal with this." "Rachel, listen to me." Vanessa took my hands in hers. "What Mom said in there, it was cruel and it was wrong. You know that, right?" I looked away, uncomfortable with her direct gaze. "It's fine. She's entitled to her opinion." "No, it's not fine. And that wasn't an opinion. It was a deliberate attack designed to hurt you at the moment when you shared news that should have made her proud." Vanessa squeezed my hands. "I am so incredibly proud of you. Partner at 35? That's extraordinary." Unexpected tears threatened at her genuine excitement for my achievement. "Thanks, V. I mean it. And for what it's worth, Thomas and I don't think your life choices are worthless. Quite the opposite. Do you know how many times I've bragged about my brilliant big sister who's out there saving companies and jobs?" I managed a small smile. "Probably about as many times as I've bragged about my amazing little sister who's changing how we approach early childhood education." Vanessa's work developing innovative curricula for underserved preschools had recently received national recognition, though our mother consistently minimized it as such a nice hobby while you prepare for children of your own. "The difference," Vanessa said gently, "is that I can count on your support being genuine. You've never once suggested that my career was just a placeholder for some real achievement. Because it's not. What you do matters." "So, does what?" "You do." She paused. "Rachel, I need to tell you something. I almost didn't go through with this wedding. This caught me completely off guard. What? Why? You and Thomas are perfect together. We are, she agreed. But I almost called it off 3 months ago because I was terrified of becoming mom, of measuring my whole identity through marriage and family, of turning into someone who resents her own choices and takes it out on her children. I stared at her. You could never be like that. You're the most self-aware person I know. Maybe, but the fear was real. And you know what helped me work through it? Talking to you. Seeing how you've created this life that's completely authentic to who you are, regardless of external expectations. You showed me it was possible to define success on your own terms. Vanessa. I was genuinely speechless. So when Mom calls you worthless, what she's really saying is that she can't control you, can't make you validate her life choices by replicating them, and that terrifies her. In all our years of navigating our complicated family dynamics, Vanessa and I had never spoken this directly about our mother's psychological patterns. We had developed an unspoken agreement to manage her individually, to absorb her criticisms separately, to avoid comparing notes on her divergent expectations for each of us. When did you get so insightful about all this? I asked. She smiled. Therapy. Lots and lots of therapy. She adjusted her veil, which had caught on the bench. I should probably get back inside before Mom organizes a search party. Will you come back in? I shook my head. I think it's better if I go, but you should absolutely get back to your reception. This night is about you and Thomas, not Morgan family drama. Vanessa stood, smoothing her dress. Promise you'll call me tomorrow? I'm not leaving for the honeymoon until Monday. I promise. She leaned down to hug me. I love you, Rach, and I'm so proud to be your sister. I love you too, V. Thomas is a lucky man. As she turned to leave, she paused. Oh, and for what it's worth, Dad is mortified by Mom's behavior. He wanted to come find you himself, but I told him I had a better chance of convincing you not to flee the state. After she disappeared back toward the reception, I ordered an Uber and checked out of my hotel. The 3-hour drive back to Chicago would be long in formal wear, but preferable to spending the night in Greenwich, where I'd inevitably encounter family members at breakfast. As I waited for my car, I sent Vanessa a generous gift through Venmo with the message, "For whatever you and Thomas need, all my love." It wasn't until I was on the highway, my wedding heels discarded in the passenger seat and a gas station, coffee growing cold in the cup holder, that the full impact of my mother's words truly hit me. Worthless. After a lifetime of subtle undermining and qualified approval, she had finally articulated the assessment that had always lingered beneath her criticisms. Strangely, having it spoken aloud felt almost liberating. The ambiguity was gone. The hope that I might someday earn her unconditional approval could finally be laid to rest. At 35, I was free to stop measuring my choices against an impossible standard. The irony, of course, was that by conventional metrics, I had achieved extraordinary success. I had graduated from Harvard Business School at the top of my class, built a reputation for innovative financial restructuring that saved jobs while maintaining profitability, and now had become the youngest partner at Sullivan & Reed, a firm known for its conservative advancement practices. My mother was right about one thing, though. I did come home to an empty apartment each night. My relationships had been casualties of my career focus, not because commitment to both was impossible, but because I hadn't yet found someone who understood my passion for my work without feeling threatened by it. As Chicago's skyline appeared in the distance, illuminated against the night sky, I felt a strange calm replace the emotional turbulence of the evening. My mother's words, intended to wound and diminish, had somehow cleared space for a more honest assessment of my life. Yes, there were aspects I wanted to develop further, areas of imbalance I hoped to address. But worthless? The characterization was so patently absurd. that it had inadvertently freed me from giving her evaluations any further weight. I pulled into my assigned parking space at 3:17 a.m., exhausted but oddly energized. My apartment, a spacious two-bedroom, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan, welcomed me with the peaceful order I maintained as a counterbalance to the chaos of corporate restructuring. I kicked off my remaining shoe, unzipped my formal dress, and poured a glass of water before checking my phone. 3 missed calls from my father. A text from Zoe asking for confirmation that I'd made it home safely. A surprisingly thoughtful message from Thomas expressing regret about the evening's events. And an email notification that would prove remarkably significant in the week ahead. Confidential, Parkview financial audit findings. Immediate attention required. Had I known that the contents of that email would connect directly to my mother's situation, I might have opened it immediately. Instead, I set my phone on the charger, promising myself I'd address everything after a few hours' sleep. What I couldn't have anticipated was how completely the dynamics of power and worth in my family were about to be reconfigured, or that within 7 days, the woman who had called me worthless would be desperately seeking my help to save everything she valued. I woke Monday morning to golden sunlight streaming through my partially closed blinds, momentarily disoriented by my surroundings. For a split second, I expected to find myself in the hotel room in Greenwich, before remembering my midnight drive back to Chicago. The events of Vanessa's wedding hit me in waves. The ceremony, my partnership announcement, my mother's cutting words, the drive home. My phone showed 7 missed calls, 3 from my father, 2 from Vanessa, 1 from Zoe, and 1 from an unknown Connecticut number that I suspected was my mother, though she rarely called directly when she could deploy my father as her diplomatic envoy. I wasn't ready to deal with any of them. Instead, I made coffee and carried my laptop to the small balcony overlooking Lake Michigan. The June morning was already warm, promising heat later, but for now, the temperature was perfect, a gentle reminder that Chicago summers offered their own compensations for the brutal winters. Typically, I managed her criticisms through deflection or strategic retreat, preserving the fragile peace for family gatherings exactly like this one. But something about this day, perhaps seeing my sister so genuinely happy, perhaps the contrast between Vanessa's authentic joy and my mother's manufactured grievances, had depleted my reserves of diplomatic patience. "You've never understood what truly matters in life," she said, her voice rising slightly. "All these achievements you're so proud of, what do they really amount to? Numbers on a bank statement? Your sister is building something real, something lasting. A marriage, a family, connections that matter. What will you have when you're my age? Who will care about your precious partnership then?" I was acutely aware that our conversation was no longer private. Nearby guests had abandoned the pretense of not listening, and a few family members were moving in our direction, recognizing the warning signs of a Morgan family incident in progress. "I think," I said, keeping my voice deliberately even, "that we have very different definitions of success. And that's okay, but I won't apologize for building a life that makes me proud, even if it's not the one you would have chosen." "Proud?" My mother's laugh held no humor. "What is there to be proud of? A woman your age, alone, choosing work over everything? Meaningful. It's not something to celebrate, Rachel. It's a failure. You're intelligent, you're capable, but when it comes to what really matters, you're—" She hesitated, and I should have walked away in that moment of suspension, but some masochistic part of me needed to hear it, needed the confirmation of what I'd always felt she thought of me. "I'm what, Mom?" I challenged quietly. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment I saw something beyond the disapproval, perhaps fear, perhaps genuine bewilderment at having produced a daughter so different from herself. But then her expression hardened. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Martin seemed genuinely impressed. Congratulations. That's quite an achievement. My mother's expression flickered between surprise and something darker. A partner? Well, I suppose that will make it even harder for you to focus on starting a family. You're not getting any younger, Rachel. Mom, I said quietly, today is about Vanessa and Thomas. Let's keep it that way. But Diane Morgan had never been one to relinquish control of a conversation once she'd set its direction. I'm only thinking of your happiness, darling. Success is wonderful, but what good is an empty house and no one to share it with? Look how happy your sister is. I am happy, Mom. My life just looks different from what you imagined for me. Different, she repeated, swirling the champagne in her glass. Yes, you've always insisted on being different. Ever since you were a child, refusing to wear the dresses I bought you, choosing those science camps over dance lessons. Always the contrary one. Martin shifted uncomfortably, belatedly recognizing he'd been drafted into a family dynamic that preceded him. I should probably check in with the Hendersons, he said. We're discussing a potential vacation property. Very nice meeting you, Rachel. Congratulations again on the partnership. As he retreated, my mother's veneer of social politeness evaporated. You couldn't just play along, could you? Martin is considered quite a catch in Greenwich. Susan Kellerman has been trying to set him up with her daughter for months. I'm not interested in being caught, Mom, and I'm certainly not moving. To Greenwich to become a trophy wife for a divorce attorney. No, you'd rather bury yourself in spreadsheets and board meetings. Such a waste. She finished her champagne in one elegant swallow. Your father and I gave you every advantage, every opportunity. Do you know what I could have done with the education you received? This was familiar territory, my mother's parallel life narrative, the brilliant career she might have had if not for the sacrifices of motherhood. The implied accusation that my success was both an obligation from her, sacrifice and a rebuke of her choices. I'm grateful for everything you and Dad provided, I said, the rehearsed response of decades. You made it possible for me to build the life I have. The life you have, she repeated, her voice taking on the slightly theatrical quality that signaled an escalating confrontation. Alone in that sterile apartment in Chicago, working 60-hour weeks with no one to come home to. Is that really what you want to celebrate? I glanced around, becoming aware that several nearby guests were studiously pretending not to overhear our conversation. This isn't the time or place, Mom. It never is with you. Always deflecting, always too busy, always running away from any real conversation about your life choices. I took a deep breath, trying to maintain the peace for Vanessa's sake. I'm going to get some air. We can talk another time. I had turned to leave when she caught my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. That's right, walk away. That's what you do best, isn't it? Run back to your precious career and your empty life. You know what breaks my heart? Watching Vanessa achieve everything a mother dreams of while you just waste your potential. Something in me snapped. A tension wire that had been stretched, taut for 35 years, finally breaking under one pressure point too many. What exactly am I wasting, Mom? My Harvard MBA? My 6-figure income? My professional reputation? Or just my potential to fulfill your particular vision of womanhood? Her eyes widened, unused to direct confrontation from me. Typically, I managed her criticisms through deflection or strategic retreat, preserving the fragile peace for family gatherings exactly like this one. But something about this day, perhaps seeing my sister so genuinely happy, perhaps the contrast between Vanessa's authentic joy and my mother's manufactured grievances, had depleted my reserves of diplomatic patience. You've never understood what truly matters in life, she said, her voice rising slightly. All these achievements you're so proud of, What do they really amount to? Numbers on a bank statement? Your sister is building something real, something lasting. A marriage, a family, connections that matter. What will you have when you're my age? Who will care about your precious partnership then? I was acutely aware that our conversation was no longer private. Nearby guests had abandoned the pretense of not listening, and a few family members were moving in our direction, recognizing the warning signs of a Morgan family incident in progress. I think, I said, keeping my voice deliberately even, that we have very different definitions of success. And that's okay. But I won't apologize for building a life that makes me proud, even if it's not the one you would have chosen. Proud? My mother's laugh held no humor. What is there to be proud of? A woman your age, alone, choosing work over everything? Meaningful. It's not something to celebrate, Rachel. It's a failure. You're intelligent, you're capable, but when it comes to what really matters, you're... She hesitated, and I should have walked away in that moment of suspension. But some masochistic part of me needed to hear it, needed the confirmation of what I'd always felt she thought of me. I'm what, Mom? I challenged quietly. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment I saw something beyond the disapproval, perhaps fear, perhaps genuine bewilderment at having produced a daughter so different from herself. But then her expression hardened. You're worthless, she said, each syllable precise and deliberate. All your degrees and promotions and fancy job titles, worthless if you've failed at the most fundamental aspects of being a woman, of being a daughter. Just worthless. The word hung in the air between us, seeming to expand and echo in the sudden silence that had fallen in our immediate vicinity. I became aware of several things simultaneously. My father approaching with alarm on his face. Vanessa frozen mid-laugh at the head table, the wedding photographer awkwardly lowering his camera, and a server who had stopped with a tray of champagne flutes, uncertain whether to proceed through our invisible blast zone. I could have responded, in kind. Could have mentioned the second mortgage on my parents' house that they thought I didn't know about. Could have referenced my mother's growing dependence on midday wine to manage her dissatisfaction with her own choices. Could have unleashed 3 decades of accumulated observations about her insecurities and compensatory behaviors. Instead, I simply nodded once, as if she'd confirmed something I'd long suspected. Thank you for clarifying how you feel, I said quietly. I won't trouble you with my worthless presence any longer. My father reached us just as I turned away. Diane, what's happening? Rachel, wait. But I was already moving through the reception hall with as much dignity as I could muster, accepting that my departure would become part of Morgan family lore. Another piece of evidence in the case against Rachel, the difficult daughter who couldn't even behave appropriately at her sister's wedding. Outside, the June evening had softened into twilight, the gardens of the Bellamy estate illuminated by tasteful landscape lighting. I found a stone bench partially hidden by an ornamental cherry tree and sat down, trembling slightly with adrenaline and suppressed emotion. My phone buzzed in my clutch. Zoe, who had witnessed the confrontation from across the room. Are you okay? That looked nuclear. Do you need extraction? I texted back. I'm okay. Getting an Uber in a few minutes. We'll call you tomorrow. I opened my work email, bypassing the personal messages to focus on the mysterious audit notification that had arrived during my drive home. As a financial restructuring specialist, unexpected audit findings were both common in my line of work and rarely good news. The email was from Victor Jang, CFO at Parkview Financial, a regional investment firm catering to high-net-worth clients throughout the Midwest and Northeast. Parkview wasn't one of my clients, though I'd had several professional interactions with Victor at industry conferences. Rachel, I need your expertise on a sensitive matter requiring immediate discretion. Our internal audit has identified irregular transactions in several managed accounts. The pattern suggests potential fraud at the advisor level rather than systemic issues. But the implications are serious. Can we discuss as soon as possible? I'd prefer to keep this conversation offline until we have a better understanding of the scope. I frowned, scanning the brief document attached to the email, which outlined transaction patterns without identifying specific accounts. The methodology was sophisticated, systematic enough to avoid casual detection, but not so aggressive that it would trigger automated compliance alerts. Someone who understood both financial systems and their monitoring limitations had designed this approach. My phone rang again. Zoe, persistent as always. "You can't hide forever," she said when I answered. "I need verbal confirmation that you're alive and relatively untraumatized." "I'm alive," I confirmed, leaning back in my chair and watching a sailboat move across the horizon. "And working, which is my preferred coping mechanism." "Of course it is," Zoe sighed. "Want to talk about what happened?" "Not particularly." I took a sip of coffee. I think worthless was actually helpful. It clarified where I stand. Your mother is a narcissistic nightmare who can't handle having a daughter more successful than she ever was, Zoe declared with the brutal honesty of a 20-year friendship. "But that's not why I'm calling. Have you seen the email from Sullivan?" "What email?" "The all-staff announcement about your partnership. It went out this morning. Much more complimentary than I expected from those stuffy old men. Check your personal email." I switched tabs and found the message. The announcement was indeed surprisingly effusive, highlighting my work saving the Detroit manufacturing firm and noting that I was both the youngest partner in the firm's history and the first woman to achieve the position in less than 10 years. "Quite the contrast, isn't it?" Zoe observed. "On Saturday night, your mother calls you worthless, and Monday morning your accomplishments are being celebrated company-wide. Almost poetic." "Validation from Sullivan and Reed doesn't erase a lifetime of maternal disapproval," I pointed out. "No, but it does objectively refute her assessment. You're measurably, verifiably successful by conventional standards. She just keeps moving the goalposts." Zoe wasn't wrong. Throughout my life, each achievement had prompted a swift recalibration of expectations from my mother. Perfect grades were dismissed because anyone can memorize information. Academic. Scholarships were minimized because they weren't for athletics or arts. My Harvard acceptance was tempered with concerns about becoming too intellectual for your own good. Each milestone that should have merited pride had instead triggered a subtle reframing that positioned it as somehow insufficient. "Anyway," I said, changing the subject, "I have an interesting situation with Parkview Financial. Potentially serious fraud involving managed accounts." "That small firm in Greenwich?" Zoe asked. I paused, coffee cup halfway to my lips. "Greenwich? I thought they were based in Chicago with regional offices." "The main office is here, but they acquired Greenwich Investment Partners about 2 years ago. It was in the business section. Local firm goes national, that sort of thing." Vague memory surfaced of seeing something about the acquisition, which I'd paid little attention to at the time. Greenwich was my parents' world, not mine. "Interesting timing," I murmured, my mind already connecting dots that seemed increasingly non-coincidental. "I need to look into something. I'll call you later." After hanging up, I did a quick search for Greenwich Investment Partners. The acquisition had indeed been completed approximately 20 months ago, with Parkview retaining most of the original staff, but implementing new management systems and compliance protocols. This timing aligned with the questionable transactions identified in the audit. I called Victor Jang, who answered on the second ring. "Rachel, thank you for getting back to me so quickly. I wasn't expecting to hear from you on a Monday morning after the holiday weekend." "The patterns in your report are concerning," I said, bypassing pleasantries. "How many accounts are affected?" "That's what we're still determining." The initial review identified 14 accounts with irregular transaction sequences, but we're conducting a comprehensive audit of all accounts managed through the Greenwich office. My suspicion crystallized into something more concrete. The Greenwich office specifically? Not other regional branches? Correct. All flagged accounts are managed through Greenwich, primarily by 3 advisors who came with the acquisition. We've kept this contained to our internal audit team, but I'm concerned about potential regulatory implications and client impact. I understand, I said, my mind racing ahead to connections I wasn't ready to verbalize. I can be at your Chicago office tomorrow morning. In the meantime, I'll need complete transaction records for the flagged accounts, advisor commission, structures, and any communication logs you can legally provide. After finalizing arrangements with Victor, I sat staring at the lake, processing implications that seemed increasingly personal. My father had been with Greenwich Investment Partners for over 30 years, managing portfolios for local professionals and old money families. When Parkview acquired the firm, he had stayed on, pleased with the expanded resources while maintaining his client relationships. I hadn't paid much attention to his professional transition, beyond noting his satisfaction with the new arrangement. My father and I maintained a cordial relationship that carefully avoided both financial discussions and my mother's critical assessments. He had never been the direct source of disapproval in my life, but neither had he been a consistent defender against it. Now, I wondered if there was a connection between the audit findings at Parkview's Greenwich office and my mother's escalated hostility at the wedding. Financial pressure could explain her increased drinking, the sharper edge to her criticisms, the almost desperate quality of her attempts to guide me toward a more conventional life path. My phone rang again, the unknown Connecticut number from earlier. I hesitated, then answered. Rachel Morgan. Rachel, it's your father. His voice sounded strained, lacking its usual measured calm. I've been trying to reach you since Saturday night. I've been busy, I replied neutrally. He sighed. Your mother regrets what happened at the wedding. She was upset and said things she didn't mean. The familiar script, my father smoothing over my mother's behavior without actually acknowledging its inappropriateness. This pattern had defined my childhood. Explosive criticism from my mother, followed by my father's diplomatic efforts to restore surface harmony without addressing the underlying dynamics. Did she ask you to call and say that? I asked. His hesitation provided the answer. She's under a lot of stress right now. We both are. What kind of stress, Dad? I asked, deciding to approach the situation directly. Financial stress, perhaps? Another pause, longer this time. What makes you ask that? Professional intuition, I said, which wasn't entirely untrue. Is there something going on that I should know about? It's nothing for you to worry about, he said quickly. Just some temporary cash flow issues with property investments. It'll sort itself out. Property investments. My father had never mentioned real estate holdings beyond their home. This felt like new information, deliberately presented to divert attention from potentially more complicated financial entanglements. Dad, if you're having serious financial problems, I might be able to help, not just with money, but with restructuring strategies. It's kind of you to offer, but unnecessary, he insisted with forced lightness. Now, about your mother. She'd like to speak with you directly, to apologize. I'm not ready for that conversation, I said honestly, and I'm about to be very busy with a new client situation. Tell her I got your message. After we disconnected, I sat with growing certainty that the Parkview audit and my parents' situation were connected. Financial stress could explain my mother's behavior, but not excuse it. Whatever was happening in Greenwich, I needed objective information before engaging further with family dynamics. I spent the rest of Monday reviewing the files Victor sent over, methodically analyzing transaction patterns across the flagged accounts. By evening, I had identified a sophisticated scheme involving selective timing of trades, improper fee structures, and what appeared to be preferential allocation of investment opportunities. all practices that benefited advisors at the expense of clients. Tuesday morning, I arrived at Parkview's Chicago headquarters at 7:30 a.m., dressed in what Zoe called my financial assassin outfit, a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that projected both authority and uncompromising standards. Victor met me in the lobby, his expression revealing the strain of the situation. "Thank you for coming so quickly," he said, as he escorted me to a secure conference room where 3 members of Parkview's internal audit team waited. The situation has developed further overnight. For the next 4 hours, we delved deeper into the audit findings, identifying systematic issues that went beyond individual advisor misconduct to suggest potential supervisory failures. By noon, it was clear that at least 28 client accounts had been impacted, with combined losses approaching $3 million. Not catastrophic for a firm of Parkview's size, but devastating for the affected clients and potentially ruinous for the firm's reputation. "We need to notify the SEC," I concluded, reviewing my notes. "The patterns here suggest intentional misconduct rather than administrative errors." Victor nodded grimly. "I feared as much. What's your recommendation for containing the damage?" "Full disclosure, immediate remediation for affected clients, and cooperation with regulatory investigations," I advised. "Trying to handle this quietly will only compound the problems when it inevitably comes to light. And it will come to light." While the audit team dispersed to prepare documentation for regulators, Victor asked me to stay behind. "There's another dimension to this situation," he said once we were alone. "One of our most experienced advisors appears to be centrally involved, Charles Morgan." Though I'd been bracing for this confirmation since yesterday, hearing my father's name stated directly still felt like a physical shock. "Charles Morgan is my father," I disclosed after a moment. "I suspected a connection when you mentioned the Greenwich office, but I wasn't certain until now." Victor looked genuinely surprised. "I had no idea. This creates a potential conflict of interest." "It does," I agreed. "I should recuse myself from any aspects of the investigation directly involving my father. However, I can still advise on general remediation strategy and client communication approaches." "I appreciate your transparency," Victor said, "and I understand this puts you in an incredibly difficult position." "Professional ethics come first," I said firmly, though my mind was racing with implications. "What specifically is my father alleged to have done?" Victor hesitated, then pushed a folder across the table. These accounts were all under his direct management. The transaction patterns suggest he was timing trades to benefit certain accounts, primarily his own and those of several close associates, at the expense of others. I opened the folder, scanning documentation of what appeared to be a classic front-running scheme. My father had apparently been using advanced knowledge of large block trades to execute personal transactions first, capturing price advantages before client orders moved the market. Additionally, he had been allocating the most profitable investment opportunities to a select group of preferred accounts while placing underperforming assets in others. "How long has this been happening?" I asked, maintaining professional composure despite my internal turmoil. "Based on our review, approximately 18 months, essentially since shortly after the acquisition. Our compliance systems flagged some irregularities about 4 months ago, but initial reviews didn't connect the patterns. It wasn't until a client complained about underperformance relative to benchmarks that we initiated the comprehensive audit. 18 months aligned with what my father had called temporary cash flow issues with property investments. The timeline suggested he had started manipulating accounts shortly after Parkview implemented new systems, perhaps believing the transition period would provide cover for questionable activities. Has he been confronted with these findings? Victor shook his head. Not yet. We wanted to complete the investigation before approaching any of the advisors involved. That conversation is scheduled for tomorrow morning. As I left Parkview's offices that afternoon, The weight of what I'd discovered sat heavily. My professional expertise had inadvertently placed me adjacent to what would likely become a career-ending scandal for my father, potentially involving civil penalties and even criminal charges depending on the full scope of the misconduct. Yet, despite the professional complications, a strange clarity was emerging. My mother's escalating criticism, her increased drinking, her desperate attempts to push me toward a secure marriage, all could be viewed through the lens of mounting financial pressure and fear of exposure. Her worthless assessment at the wedding might have been triggered as much by her own precarious circumstances as by my announcement of professional advancement. When my phone rang that evening, displaying my mother's number directly for the first time in months, I wasn't entirely surprised. Something had changed in the family dynamic, forcing direct communication rather than the triangulated messages typically delivered through my father. "Hello, Mom," I answered, keeping my tone neutral. "Rachel." Her voice held none of its usual imperious confidence. Instead, she sounded tentative, almost fragile. "I've been trying to reach you." "I've been busy with work," I replied, neither accepting nor rejecting her implied overture. "Of course," she said quickly. "Your father mentioned you're working on a new client situation. That's wonderful." The awkward pleasantry hung between us, so divorced from our last interaction that it bordered on absurd. I waited, curious to see how she would navigate from superficial conversation to whatever had prompted this uncharacteristic direct contact. "About what happened at Vanessa's wedding," she continued when I didn't respond. "I was upset and said, things I deeply regret. The things I said. They weren't true, Rachel. You're not worthless. You're accomplished and successful in ways I never was." The admission was unprecedented. Never in my memory had my mother acknowledged my accomplishments without qualification or directly admitted being wrong. Under normal circumstances, I might have been moved by this apparent breakthrough. Given what I now knew, I remained cautious. "Thank you for saying that," I replied carefully. "I was wondering," she said, her voice taking on an artificially casual tone that immediately triggered my suspicion, "if you might be able to visit soon. There's something your father and I need to discuss with you, and it would be better in person." "What kind of something?" I asked, though I already had a good idea. Her hesitation spoke volumes. "It's a bit complicated. A financial matter that we could use your expertise on." "Is this about Dad's activities at Parkview Financial?" The sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line confirmed my suspicion. "How do you know about that?" "Ironically, I've been brought in as a consultant on their internal investigation," I explained, seeing no reason to withhold information that would become evident soon enough. "I learned today that Dad is one of the advisors under scrutiny." Oh God. The two words carried genuine fear, stripping away the composed facade my mother had maintained throughout my life. "Rachel, you don't understand. It's not what it seems." "Then explain it to me," I challenged. "Because from my professional perspective, it looks like Dad has been engaging in front-running and improper allocation practices that have cost clients millions while personally benefiting from the transactions." "It was temporary," she insisted, her voice rising with desperation. "Just until our investment property turned around. He was going to make it right." "That's not how securities fraud works, Mom. Once the line is crossed, you can't just put the money back and pretend it never happened." "But he did it for us, for our retirement, for your sister's wedding. We were going to lose everything." I processed this confirmation of my suspicions with a strange detachment. "What happened to your savings? You and Dad always emphasized financial responsibility." A beat of silence followed. "The market crash in 2008 hit us harder than we let on. Your father's commission structure changed after that. Then medical bills." "Medical bills." This was new information. "Who was sick?" "Your father had prostate cancer 5 years ago. We didn't tell you girls because he didn't want you to worry, especially with you finishing your MBA and Vanessa just starting her career. The treatment was successful, but the insurance didn't cover experimental procedures he needed. We remortgaged the house, used our savings. The pieces fell into place. Financial pressures mounting over years, pride preventing them from seeking help, desperation eventually pushing my father toward ethical compromises he would have previously condemned. It explained much, but justified nothing. "Why didn't you tell us?" I asked. "Vanessa and I could have helped." "Your father wouldn't hear of it," my mother said, her voice tight with restrained emotion. "He said we couldn't burden you with our problems when you were building your futures. And then when things started to improve at Parkview, he thought he could handle it himself." "By defrauding clients?" "He didn't see it that way at first," she insisted. "He thought he was just borrowing against future performance." I closed my eyes, recognizing the rationalization that began many financial frauds. "And now? Now the bank is foreclosing on our home. Your father's been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. We've received a letter from Parkview's legal department about potential recovery of funds." Her voice broke. "Rachel, we have nowhere else to turn. Your sister just got married. She can't help with this. You're the only one who might understand how to navigate this situation." The irony wasn't lost on me. The daughter deemed worthless just days ago was now the only hope for salvation. Part of me wanted to respond with the same dismissive cruelty I'd experienced at the wedding, to let her feel the impact of her words reflected back at her in this moment of vulnerability. But beneath the hurt and anger, I recognized something fundamental. This crisis offered a rare opportunity to address the dysfunction that had shaped our family dynamics for decades. Real change often emerges only when existing patterns become unsustainable. "I'll be in Greenwich on Thursday," I said finally. "I need to be at Parkview tomorrow for the continuation of the investigation, but I can come to the house after that. We'll discuss options then." "Thank you," my mother whispered, genuine gratitude replacing her usual careful composure. "Rachel, Save it for Thursday," I interrupted, not ready for whatever emotional declaration might follow. "And Mom?" "Don't expect miracles. What Dad did has serious consequences that can't simply be wished away." After we disconnected, I stood at my window overlooking the Chicago skyline, considering the strange reversal of circumstances. In less than a week, I had gone from being judged worthless to being the family's last hope for financial salvation. The daughter who had failed at the most fundamental aspects of being a woman was now being sought for the very expertise that had been dismissed as empty achievement. I felt no satisfaction in this reversal, only a somber recognition of how financial desperation could warp behavior, relationships, and values. My father's actions were unethical and potentially criminal, but they had emerged from a complex interplay of pride, fear, and misguided responsibility that I was only beginning to understand. As I prepared for bed that night, my phone buzzed, with a text from Vanessa. "Mom just called me in tears about Dad. What's happening? Call me when you can." I responded simply, "Financial situation more complicated than it appears. I'm handling it. Enjoy your honeymoon. We'll talk when you're back." Some burdens didn't need to be shared immediately, especially not with a sister in the first days of her marriage. The coming weeks would bring enough complications for all of us. What remained unclear was whether this crisis would ultimately destroy what remained of our family connections or create space for something more authentic to emerge from the wreckage of carefully maintained appearances. Either way, the dynamics had been irrevocably altered. The question now was what we would build in place of the collapsed structure. The flight to Connecticut on Thursday morning offered a rare moment of suspended reality, 90 minutes of enforced stillness between the intensity of the Parkview investigation and the emotional complexity awaiting me in Greenwich. I used the time to review the complete case file Victor had authorized for my personal assessment, despite my recusal from the aspects directly involving my father. What emerged was a pattern more troubling than initially apparent. My father's activities hadn't been isolated, incidents of opportunistic trading, but a systematic approach that had evolved over 18 months. The early transactions showed hesitation, minimal position sizes, conservative timing, suggesting someone testing boundaries. But the recent patterns revealed increasing boldness, larger positions, and more aggressive timing that significantly increased both the profits diverted and the harm to client accounts. This progression told a story beyond simple financial misconduct. It revealed the psychological evolution of someone who had started with small ethical compromises, justified by necessity, and gradually normalized increasingly serious violations. I recognized the pattern from previous corporate fraud cases I'd handled, the slippery slope from just this once to routine misconduct. As the plane began its descent into Connecticut, I closed the file and stared out the window at the manicured landscape below. Greenwich represented everything I had deliberately left behind: the careful cultivation of appearances, the rigid social hierarchies, the unspoken expectation that women like me would prioritize suitable marriages over professional accomplishments. Yet it was also where my family's crisis was unfolding, pulling me back into orbits I had worked hard to escape. The rental car I'd reserved was waiting at the airport, a modest sedan rather than the luxury vehicle the agency had initially tried to assign me when I provided my Greenwich destination. This small act of resistance against automatic assumptions felt necessary as I prepared to navigate both family dynamics and the town's ingrained expectations. My parents' home looked exactly as it had for decades: a classic colonial setback from the road, with meticulously maintained gardens and the subdued elegance that characterized old Greenwich money. Only someone with my specialized knowledge would recognize the signs of financial strain beneath the carefully preserved exterior. The subtle aging of paint that would normally have been refreshed, the driveway with hairline cracks that would typically have been immediately repaired, the landscaping that showed signs of reduced professional attention. My mother opened the door before I could ring the bell, as if she'd been watching for my arrival. The woman who greeted me bore little resemblance to the composed, critical figure from Vanessa's wedding. Her normally perfect appearance showed signs of hasty assembly, her makeup applied with less precision, her clothing selected for comfort rather than impression. Rachel. She reached toward me with an uncertain gesture, caught between her habitual reserve and an uncharacteristic need for connection. I allowed a brief embrace, noting how fragile she felt in my arms. "Where's Dad?" I asked as I entered. The familiar foyer with its antique console table and carefully curated family photographs chronicling milestone moments, graduations, award ceremonies, Vanessa's engagement. I noticed my recent accomplishments were conspicuously absent. "In his study," my mother replied, her voice lower. "He's been there since yesterday afternoon when he returned from the Parkview meeting. He's barely eaten." I nodded, unsurprised. The confrontation with Parkview's legal and compliance teams would have been devastating for someone who had built his identity around professional integrity and community respect. "Has he spoken with an attorney?" I asked, setting my overnight bag by the stairs. My mother shook her head. "He refuses. Says there's no point since he's guilty as charged." Those were his exact words. I followed her to the kitchen, where the granite countertops gleamed with the recent application of cleaning products. Stress cleaning had always been my mother's response to situations beyond her control, as if imposing order on her physical environment could somehow transfer to chaotic circumstances. "Tell me exactly what's happened since Tuesday," I said, accepting the cup of coffee she automatically prepared the way I preferred. Strong, with a splash of cream, no sugar. She sat across from me at the breakfast table, her own cup cradled between hands that showed a slight tremor. "The bank called yesterday. The foreclosure is proceeding unless we can make a substantial payment by the end of next week. Parkview has frozen your father's accounts pending investigation. They've also initiated recovery proceedings for what They're calling misappropriated funds, approximately $870,000 according to their calculations. The amount aligned with what I'd seen in the case files, not the total client losses, which approached $4.3 million, but the portion that could be directly traced to my father's personal benefit. "What about your personal accounts?" I asked. "Accounts not directly tied to Dad's activities at Parkview?" "Minimal," she admitted, the word carrying the weight of understated catastrophe. "We've been living beyond our means for years, Rachel. The house has 2 mortgages. The investments your father talked about were purchased on margin. There were credit cards you didn't know about." The comprehensive financial collapse she described was familiar territory professionally. I'd guided numerous corporate clients through similar spirals, but the personal dimension added layers of complexity beyond my expertise. "Is Dad willing to talk to me about this?" I asked. My mother glanced toward the hallway leading to my father's study. "He said he would, but Rachel, he's not himself. I've never seen him like this." I nodded, understanding the implications. My father had always embodied a certain type of masculine stoicism, emotions carefully managed, vulnerabilities concealed beneath capable professionalism. A man whose world had constricted to performative success would find total failure particularly devastating. "Give me a few minutes with him," I said, rising from the table. My father's study had been sacrosanct territory throughout my childhood, a masculine domain where important financial matters were handled and interruptions tolerated only for emergencies. The room's heavy oak door had represented the boundary between family life and my father's professional world. I knocked twice, receiving no response. After a moment's hesitation, I opened the door to find my father seated behind his desk, staring at an arrangement of family photographs. He looked up as I entered, his expression shifting from vacant contemplation to a complex mix of shame and relief. At 64, Charles Morgan had always projected disciplined vitality, regular tennis matches, careful attention to diet, the poised confidence of someone accustomed to commanding respect. The man before me seemed physically diminished, his shoulders curving inward, his skin pallid from what appeared to be both sleeplessness and shock. "Rachel." His voice retained its familiar timbre but lacked conviction. "I didn't expect you to come." "Did you think I wouldn't?" I asked, taking the leather chair opposite his desk, the position usually occupied by clients seeking his financial wisdom. "I wouldn't have blamed you if you hadn't," he replied, "especially after what your mother said at the wedding." I was surprised by this acknowledgement. My father had rarely directly addressed my mother's critical behavior, preferring diplomatic abstractions that maintained surface harmony. "I'm not here about the wedding," I said. "I'm here about Parkview, the foreclosure, and whatever else you haven't disclosed that might impact this situation." He nodded, accepting my businesslike approach. "You know most of it already, I imagine. Victor Zhang mentioned you were consulting on the investigation." "I've recused myself from the aspects directly involving you," I clarified. "But yes, I've seen the general findings." My father reached for a leather portfolio on his desk, opening it to reveal organized documentation. Even in crisis, his methodical nature remained intact. "These are the relevant statements, notices, and correspondence," he said, pushing the portfolio toward me. "I've prepared a complete accounting of what happened, when it started, and where the funds went. I won't waste your time with justifications or excuses." I scanned the first page, a chronological timeline of his financial activities beginning 5 years earlier with his cancer diagnosis and continuing through the escalating series of compromises that had culminated in the current crisis. "You documented your own fraudulent activities," I observed, noting the meticulous detail that would effectively serve as a confession in any regulatory or criminal proceeding. "I've maintained accurate records throughout," he confirmed without defensiveness. At first, I told myself it was because I would make restitution once our situation improved. Later, I think I knew it would be necessary for accountability. His matter-of-fact acknowledgement of wrongdoing contrasted sharply with the desperate rationalizations my mother had offered during our phone conversation. Where she saw temporary measures justified by circumstances, he recognized fundamental breaches of professional ethics and legal boundaries. "Why didn't you come to me before it reached this point?" I asked, the question emerging more personally than I'd intended. "Financial restructuring is literally my profession, Dad." He met my gaze directly for the first time since I'd entered the room. Pride, shame, the inability to admit that I'd failed at the very thing I was supposed to excel at, managing money responsibly. He paused. "And if I'm completely honest, the fear that you'd see me exactly as you do now, as someone who violated every principle I claimed to value." The painful accuracy of his assessment created a moment of unexpected connection between us. Throughout my childhood, my father had remained somewhat emotionally remote, present but preoccupied, supportive but distracted. This direct acknowledgement of his motivations and fears represented perhaps our most authentic exchange. "The situation is serious," I said, returning to practical assessment. "Parkview will pursue full recovery of misappropriated funds. The SEC investigation will likely result in significant penalties. Criminal charges are possible, though not certain given your age and lack of prior offenses." He nodded, accepting each point without protest. "And the house? The foreclosure could potentially be delayed through negotiation, but not indefinitely. The combination of 2 mortgages and current market conditions makes refinancing unlikely." "I understand," he said quietly. "What would you recommend as the next steps?" Speaking professionally, not as my daughter. I considered the question carefully, weighing professional expertise against personal involvement. Speaking professionally, I would recommend immediate legal representation, specializing in securities violations, voluntary cooperation with regulatory authorities, a comprehensive disclosure of assets and liabilities, and a realistic assessment of what lifestyle adjustments will be necessary going forward. "And speaking as my daughter?" he asked. I hadn't anticipated this question, which bypassed our carefully maintained boundaries to request a personal, rather than professional perspective. "Speaking as your daughter," I said after a moment, "I would say that financial mistakes, even serious ones, don't define your entire life or your worth as a person." Something shifted in his expression, a tightly held tension releasing slightly, at this unexpected offering of grace. "Thank you for that," he said simply. Our conversation was interrupted by my mother's appearance at the study door. "I've made lunch," she announced with forced normalcy. "You both need to eat something." The kitchen table, typically set with careful attention to presentation, now held simple sandwiches and a pitcher of iced tea. We sat in uncomfortable silence for several minutes, the familiar family configuration highlighting the extraordinary circumstances that had brought us together. "Have you found a solution?" my mother finally asked, directing the question to me rather than my father. "There isn't a simple solution," I replied carefully. "There will be significant consequences, both financial and potentially legal. The question is how to mitigate those consequences and rebuild from what remains." "Rebuild?" she repeated, as if testing an unfamiliar concept. "What exactly would that look like? Where would we live? How would we support ourselves? Your father will lose his license, his clients, his reputation." "Yes," I acknowledged, not softening the reality. "Your lives will change substantially, but you're not without options or resources." "What resources?" my mother challenged, her vulnerability shifting toward familiar sharpness. "Everything we have is either mortgaged, frozen, or about to be claimed by Parkview's lawyers. You have skills, experience, connections that aren't tied to Dad's professional license," I pointed out. You have family who can help during the transition, and you have options that don't require maintaining this particular lifestyle in this particular community. My mother's expression revealed how unthinkable she found this last suggestion. Greenwich wasn't just where they lived. It was integral to her identity, the framework that gave structure to her understanding of success and status. "You expect us to leave Greenwich?" she asked, genuine bewilderment in her voice. "Where would we go? What would we tell people?" "The truth," my father interjected unexpectedly, "or whatever portion of it preserves some dignity while acknowledging reality. That health issues led to financial difficulties, that we're downsizing to better manage our resources. That family is more important than maintaining appearances." My mother stared at him, clearly unaccustomed to this direct approach after decades of mutual investment in careful image management. "Charles, be reasonable. We can't just—" "Diane," he interrupted gently, "the life we've been maintaining hasn't existed in reality for years. It's been a performance funded by increasingly desperate measures. I'm tired of pretending." The simple admission seemed to deflate her remaining resistance. She looked between us, perhaps recognizing that the unified front I presented with my father represented a fundamental shift in family dynamics. "What do you suggest then?" she asked me, her tone holding more resignation than hostility. "First, we need accurate numbers. A complete financial picture, including all assets, liabilities, income sources, and spending requirements. Then we can explore options for downsizing, relocation if necessary, and potential income streams that don't depend on Dad's securities license. And in the meantime," she pressed, "the foreclosure, the Parkview situation, potential legal proceedings?" I hesitated, recognizing that my next words would significantly alter our relationship. "I can provide temporary financial support while we develop a sustainable plan. I can also connect Dad with appropriate legal representation and help negotiate with creditors." "You would do that?" my mother asked, genuine surprise in her voice. "After everything?" The question contained layers of meaning beyond immediate financial assistance. After years of criticism and dismissal. After being called worthless at my sister's wedding. After being valued only when my resources became necessary for their survival. "I would," I confirmed. "Not without conditions, but yes." "What conditions?" my father asked. "Complete financial transparency going forward. Acceptance of necessary lifestyle changes without resistance or resentment. And a fundamental reset of how we communicate as a family. No more criticism disguised as concern. No more achievements dismissed because they don't fit preconceived notions of success." My mother looked as if she might object to this last requirement, then seemed to reconsider, perhaps recognizing her limited negotiating position. "Those seem reasonable," my father said when she remained silent. "More than reasonable given the circumstances." The afternoon passed in methodical financial archaeology, uncovering accounts, documenting liabilities, creating a comprehensive inventory of assets that might be liquidated to address immediate needs. By evening, we had assembled a clearer picture of their financial reality, which was simultaneously better and worse than initially appeared. "Victor spoke highly of your handling of the situation." He paused, studying me with the penetrating gaze that had intimidated countless opposing counsel over 5 decades of practice. "He also mentioned that your father appears to be centrally involved in the issues they've uncovered." "That's correct," I acknowledged, seeing no benefit in deflection or minimization. "Family complications can be among the most challenging aspects of professional life," Marcus observed, "particularly in our field, where ethical boundaries must remain absolutely clear." The statement hung between us, not quite a question, but clearly inviting elaboration. I considered how much to share, weighing professional discretion against the potential benefit of Marcus's experience and perspective. "The situation is still developing," I said carefully. My father acknowledges responsibility for his actions and is preparing to face the consequences. I'm helping my parents understand their options within appropriate professional boundaries. Marcus's expression remained neutral, but I detected a subtle softening around his eyes. When I was about your age, newly made partner, career trajectory looking promising, my brother was indicted for tax fraud related to his construction business. This personal disclosure surprised me. Marcus rarely shared details about his family life, maintaining the careful separation between professional and personal spheres that characterized his generation of business leaders. I wasn't aware of that, I said. Few people are. It was before the internet made such information permanently accessible. He leaned forward slightly. The point is, I understand the unique challenge of maintaining professional integrity while supporting family through their worst moments. It requires a balance few people truly comprehend unless they've experienced it. How did you manage it? I asked, genuinely curious about his approach to a situation that paralleled my own. By establishing clear boundaries, he replied without hesitation. I helped my brother find excellent legal representation. I provided personal financial support for his family while he served his sentence. But I never compromised my professional ethics or this firm's reputation by attempting to influence the legal process or minimize the seriousness of his actions. The clarity of his delineation resonated with my own instinctive approach to the current situation. That seems like wise counsel. The hardest part, Marcus continued, wasn't the practical arrangements but the emotional weight, carrying both my concern for him and my disappointment in his choices. Understanding without excusing, supporting without enabling. He rose from the chair, signaling the conclusion of a conversation that had unexpectedly shifted from professional acknowledgement to personal guidance. If you need flexibility in your schedule to address these family matters, consider it authorized. Your performance has consistently demonstrated that you don't require micromanagement to fulfill your responsibilities. I appreciate that, Marcus, and the perspective. He paused at the doorway. One final observation from someone who's navigated similar waters. This experience, painful as it is, will likely make you an even more effective advisor to clients facing corporate crises. The best professional judgment is informed by personal understanding of human complexity. After he departed, I sat with the unexpected gift of his disclosure and insight. Marcus Sullivan, whose legendary professional discipline had shaped the firm's culture for decades, had deliberately shared a vulnerable chapter from his own history to provide context and guidance for my current challenge. The gesture contained a subtle message beyond its explicit content, an acknowledgement that I was now viewed as a colleague worthy of such candor, rather than merely a promising subordinate. This shift in professional relationship arrived precisely when my family dynamics were undergoing their own transformation, creating a strange symmetry between my personal and professional worlds. In both contexts, established patterns were being disrupted, creating space for potentially more authentic connections. My contemplation was interrupted by a text from my father. Attorney meeting scheduled for 2 p.m. ET. Can you join by video? I confirmed my availability, then turned attention to organizing my week to accommodate both professional obligations and family crisis management. The Detroit manufacturing client needed follow-up on implementation of our restructuring recommendations. 2 potential new clients required preliminary assessments, and the Parkview investigation continued, though my direct involvement was now appropriately limited. By noon, I had created a workable schedule that reserved specific time blocks for family matters while maintaining momentum on key professional responsibilities. The discipline required wasn't unfamiliar. I'd always operated with careful attention to boundaries and priorities, but the emotional complexity added a dimension beyond my typical strategic planning. The attorney my father had retained came highly recommended by a former colleague of mine who specialized in securities litigation. Lawrence Keller projected the quiet confidence of someone who had navigated similar waters many times before, his demeanor neither unduly optimistic nor unnecessarily alarmist, as he outlined potential approaches to my father's situation. Based on my preliminary review, Lawrence explained during our video conference, we have several factors working in our favor. Mr. Morgan's clean prior record, his voluntary disclosure and cooperation, his age, and the absence of client complaints. Prior to Parkview's internal investigation, what's your assessment of potential criminal exposure? I asked, maintaining professional detachment despite the personal stakes. Given the documented pattern and dollar amounts involved, the U.S. Attorney's Office could pursue charges, Lawrence acknowledged. However, we have viable paths to potentially avoid prosecution through negotiated settlements with both Parkview and regulatory authorities. My father, visible in a separate video window, nodded without comment. His subdued demeanor reflected the gravity of his circumstances, but also a certain clarity that had been absent during years of mounting financial desperation and ethical compromise. The immediate priority, Lawrence continued, is preparing a comprehensive proposal for Parkview regarding restitution. Their recovery efforts will significantly influence whether this remains primarily a regulatory matter or escalates to criminal prosecution. This aligned with my own assessment. Parkview's primary concern would be recovering misappropriated funds and limiting reputational damage, rather than pursuing punitive measures against a 64-year-old advisor with an otherwise unblemished record. I've prepared a preliminary asset inventory, I said, sharing my screen to display the financial analysis I'd developed over the weekend. This identifies resources that could be liquidated immediately for partial restitution, with proposed timelines for converting additional assets and establishing a payment structure for the remaining balance. Lawrence reviewed the document with professional appreciation. This is extremely helpful, Ms. Morgan. More comprehensive than what I typically receive from clients at this stage. Rachel specializes in financial restructuring for distressed companies, my father explained, a note of pride momentarily displacing his prevailing shame. She's the reason I have any hope of navigating this situation. The simple acknowledgement of my professional value, offered without qualification or comparison, struck me as significant. Throughout my career, my father had maintained polite interest in my accomplishments without demonstrating genuine understanding of my work or its importance. This direct recognition suggested a shift in perception that extended beyond our immediate circumstances. As the meeting progressed to specific legal strategies, I observed my father's responses with both professional assessment and daughterly concern. His engagement remained focused and realistic, neither minimizing the seriousness of his actions nor surrendering to despair about potential consequences. This balanced perspective represented significant emotional progress since our initial conversations in Greenwich. After concluding the video conference, I received a private message from my father. Thank you for your help today. I know this isn't how you envisioned spending your first days as partner. His acknowledgement of the imposition on my professional life, something my mother had notably not recognized, reflected growing awareness of how his actions affected others. I responded simply, "We'll get through this together." The afternoon brought another family complication as Vanessa called from the airport upon returning from her honeymoon. "I just listened to Mom's voicemail," she said, her voice tight with concern. "What exactly is happening with Dad?" Mom mentioned serious financial and legal issues, but provided no details. I hesitated, balancing my commitment to transparency against consideration for her circumstances. "It's complicated, V. Dad's facing consequences for financial misconduct at Parkview. The house is in foreclosure. They'll need significant help rebuilding." "Financial misconduct? Dad?" Her disbelief echoed my own initial reaction. "That doesn't make sense. He's the most ethically rigid person I know." The situation developed gradually, I explained, choosing words carefully. Health issues led to financial pressure. Small compromises escalated over time. He's taking responsibility and cooperating fully with investigations. The approximately $870,000 my father had diverted through improper trading practices had been used primarily to maintain their lifestyle amid decreasing legitimate income, the mortgage payments on an underwater property, country club memberships, necessary for client relationships, the elaborate wedding my mother had insisted Vanessa deserved. None of it had been saved or invested in ways that might have created a financial cushion. Parkview would demand full restitution, the house would almost certainly be lost to foreclosure, and my father faced potential SEC penalties that could deplete any remaining resources. Yet his meticulous record-keeping and apparent willingness to cooperate fully might mitigate some consequences, particularly regarding potential criminal charges. As darkness fell, we moved from the kitchen table to the living room, physical exhaustion matching emotional depletion after hours of difficult conversations. "I'll need to return to Chicago tomorrow," I said, checking upcoming commitments on my phone. "But I can work remotely part of next week to help implement immediate steps, retaining an attorney, initiating negotiations with creditors, exploring housing alternatives." "You've already done more than we had any right to expect," my father said quietly. My mother, who had been uncharacteristically silent during much of the afternoon's practical discussions, finally spoke. "I don't understand why you're helping us, Rachel, especially after what I said at the wedding." The question seemed genuine rather than manipulative, a rare moment of authentic curiosity about motivations she couldn't reconcile with her understanding of relationships, which had always been fundamentally transactional. "Because that's what family should do," I replied after consideration. "Not enable self-destructive behavior or maintain harmful patterns, but provide support for genuine efforts to address problems and rebuild. And because holding on to resentment won't improve any of our lives going forward." "I truly am sorry for what I said," she offered, the apology lacking her usual qualifications or deflections. "I was terrified of what was coming, and instead of asking for help, I lashed out at you for having the very strength and independence that might have prevented all this if we'd been honest sooner." The admission represented a level of self-awareness I hadn't witnessed from her before. Whether it reflected genuine insight or situational necessity remained to be seen, but I chose to accept it at face value for now. "We have a lot to work through beyond apologies," I said. "But recognizing harmful patterns is a necessary first step." "Will you tell Vanessa about this?" my father asked, concern for my sister evident in his voice. "She'll be back from her honeymoon next week." "She already knows something significant is happening," I replied. "I've kept details minimal until you decided how to approach it, but she'll need to understand the full situation soon." "I'll tell her," my mother said unexpectedly. "It should come from me. Both what's happening with our finances and how I've treated you. She deserves complete honesty from her parents, even if it's years overdue." This willingness to assume responsibility rather than manage appearances marked another departure from established patterns. Whether crisis had triggered genuine transformation or merely temporary accommodation remained to be seen. But the potential for meaningful change seemed greater than I would have believed possible days earlier. As we finished discussing immediate next steps, my father asked a question that surprised me with its vulnerability. "Do you think it's possible to rebuild a meaningful life after this kind of failure? At our age?" The question transcended financial considerations to touch on deeper existential concerns: identity, purpose, self-worth after the collapse of carefully constructed personas and priorities. "I believe it is," I said, drawing on what I'd witnessed through my professional work with individuals navigating corporate collapses and career implosions. "It won't resemble the life you've known, and the transition will be painful. But many people discover that what matters most survives the loss of status, possessions, and appearance-based respect. What matters most?" my mother repeated thoughtfully. I'm not sure I even know what that is anymore. That's something you'll need to rediscover, I acknowledged, but you won't have to do it alone. Later that night, preparing for bed in my childhood room, unchanged since high school with its academic trophies and college pennants, I received a text from Zoe. How's it going in Greenwich? Family crisis navigation proceeding according to plan? I wrote back, more productive than expected. Genuine accountability from Dad? Potential opening for healthier dynamics with Mom? Comprehensive financial disaster requiring significant intervention? Her response came quickly. So basically exactly what you do professionally, just with additional decades of emotional complications. Your billable rate should be tripled. I smiled at her characterization, recognizing its accuracy. The situation did parallel my professional work in many ways, identifying the full scope of financial damage, developing strategic interventions, implementing controlled restructuring to preserve viable elements while discarding unsustainable aspects. The emotional dimensions certainly added complexity, but also provided motivation beyond professional satisfaction. As I set my phone aside, I realized something unexpected about the day's events. Despite the difficult conversations and painful revelations, I felt a curious sense of peace. For the first time in my adult life, I was engaging with my parents, without pretense or performance, seeing them clearly as flawed, struggling humans rather than the infallible authorities of childhood or the disappointing critics of early adulthood. This shift in perspective didn't erase the history of hurtful words or dismissive judgments, but it placed those experiences within a more complex context of human limitation and fear. My mother's cutting, worthless assessment at the wedding hadn't reflected my actual value, but her own terror as her carefully constructed world began collapsing around her. Understanding this didn't excuse her behavior or guarantee changed patterns going forward. But it created possibility, where before I'd seen only permanent dysfunction. The potential for relationships based on authentic connection rather than performance and evaluation. As I drifted toward sleep, I recognized that this family crisis, while painful and complex, offered something I hadn't anticipated: the opportunity to transform worthless into worthy of truth. The daughter deemed inadequate by conventional standards had become essential to navigating unconventional challenges. The professional expertise dismissed as empty achievement had become the foundation for meaningful support in crisis. The irony wasn't lost on me, but neither was it the point. What mattered wasn't vindication or role reversal, but the potential emergence of more authentic connections from the wreckage of carefully maintained appearances. What awaited on the other side of this crisis wasn't yet clear, but for the first time in years, I felt genuine curiosity about how our family might evolve beyond the limitations that had defined us for so long. The path forward would be neither simple nor straightforward. Rebuilding from financial collapse rarely proceeded according to plan, and transforming entrenched family dynamics would require sustained effort beyond initial crisis response. But, within the painful disruption of established patterns, I glimpsed the possibility of connections based on something more substantial than performance and evaluation. Perhaps that possibility alone made the journey worthwhile. Monday morning in Chicago felt surreal after the emotional intensity of Greenwich. I arrived at the Sullivan and Reed offices an hour earlier than usual, determined to organize my professional obligations before addressing the ongoing family crisis. The familiar environment, sleek glass offices, the quiet hum of ambitious professionals preparing for their day, provided a welcome contrast to the raw vulnerability I'd witnessed in my parents' home. There she is, the newest and youngest, partner in Sullivan and Reed history. Marcus Sullivan himself stood in my office doorway, his imposing 6'4" frame filling the space. At 72, the firm's founding partner maintained a commanding presence. His silver hair and bespoke suits part of the carefully cultivated image that had helped build the firm's reputation for both excellence and discretion. "Good morning, Marcus," I replied, straightening the already aligned stacks of documents on my desk, a habit that emerged whenever I felt slightly off balance. "I didn't expect to see you this early." "Board meeting preparation," he explained, entering my office without waiting for an invitation, a prerogative of his position. "But I wanted to personally congratulate you on the partnership announcement. The response has been overwhelmingly positive, especially from clients who've worked directly with you." "Thank you. That's gratifying to hear." Marcus settled into the chair opposite my desk, his expression shifting from congratulatory to contemplative. "Victor Jang called me on Friday," he said without preamble. "He mentioned you've recused yourself from aspects of the Parkview investigation due to a family connection." I maintained my professional composure despite the unexpected pivot. "Yes. My father is one of the advisors under scrutiny. I disclosed the potential conflict as soon as I became aware of it." Marcus nodded approvingly. "Appropriate and ethically sound." "Why didn't they tell us they were struggling?" Vanessa asked, the hurt in her voice revealing deeper questions about family trust and communication. "All that money they spent on my wedding. Was that part of this?" The question pierced, through practical considerations to the emotional core of the situation. "Yes," I acknowledged. Mom was determined to maintain appearances regardless of financial reality. The wedding was part of that pattern. "I feel sick," Vanessa said quietly. "All that time I was planning my perfect day, they were drowning in problems they wouldn't share. And now they're facing foreclosure? Criminal charges? What happens next?" "We're working through options," I assured her. "Dad has good legal representation. I'm helping develop financial strategies. They'll need to relocate and significantly adjust their lifestyle, but there's a path forward." "I should cancel our house hewing appointments," she said, thinking aloud. "Thomas and I were planning to start looking this week, but that seems wrong now when Mom and Dad might not have a home." "Don't put your life on hold," I advised gently. "Making sound decisions for your future isn't disloyal. In fact, your stability will be one less worry for them during this transition." "But I should do something to help," she insisted. "What can I do?" The question reflected Vanessa's fundamental nature, always the family peacemaker, the emotional support provider, the one who anticipated others' needs before her own. While I had responded to family dysfunction by establishing independence and distance, she had adapted by becoming the emotional caretaker who smoothed rough edges and filled relational gaps. "Visit them this weekend," I suggested. "Listen without judgment. Offer emotional support without trying to fix everything. And maintain appropriate boundaries. This is primarily their situation to navigate, with our support rather than our sacrifice." "You make it sound so clinical," she observed, a hint of criticism in her voice. "Not clinical," I corrected. "Strategic. The difference between support and rescue matters here. They need to develop new patterns and perspectives, not just receive bailouts that maintain dysfunctional approaches." Our conversation continued as Vanessa processed the implications of our parents' situation for her own life and relationships. Thomas's medical practice provided financial stability that would allow them to help in measured ways, but their newlywed status and plans for starting a family created natural limits on their capacity for financial intervention. "I keep thinking about Mom at my wedding," Vanessa said toward the end of our call. "The things she said to you. Knowing what was happening behind the scenes makes it even worse, like she was lashing out at your success because it highlighted their failures." "That's probably accurate," I acknowledged, "but she's shown genuine remorse and awareness since then. The crisis has created potential for growth that might not have happened otherwise." After completing the call with assurances of ongoing coordination regarding our parents' situation, I turned back to professional responsibilities. The remainder of Monday and much of Tuesday were dedicated to client work, the familiar challenges of corporate restructuring providing welcome focus amid personal complexity. Tuesday evening brought an unexpected development via email from Victor Zhang. Parkview's board has authorized me to explore settlement options with your father that might avoid both criminal referral and public disclosure, provided full cooperation and substantial restitution. Can we discuss privately? The message confirmed my assessment that Parkview's primary motivation was recovery and reputation management rather than punishment. A negotiated resolution that avoided public proceedings would serve their interests while potentially preserving some future prospects for my father. I forwarded the email to Lawrence Keller with a brief analysis of potential approaches, then called my father to discuss implications. This is a significant opening, I explained. If structured properly, a settlement could prevent criminal charges and allow you to retain some assets for rebuilding. What would substantial restitution realistically mean? He asked, the financial analyst in him still functioning despite personal circumstances. Likely 80–90% of the identified $870,000, I estimated, which would require liquidating essentially all remaining assets, except retirement accounts protected under ERISA. Including the house. Yes, I confirmed. The house was unsustainable. Regardless, given the underwater mortgages and foreclosure proceedings, this approach would at least allow for controlled liquidation rather than forced sale. He absorbed this reality with remarkable composure. It's appropriate. The house represented everything I was trying to preserve through inappropriate means: status, appearance, a lifestyle we hadn't legitimately earned in years. Losing it is a natural consequence. His perspective reflected continuing evolution, beyond the desperate attempts to maintain appearances that had characterized recent years. Whether this represented genuine transformation or simply the clarity that sometimes emerges when long-feared consequences finally materialize remained to be seen, but the potential for healthier approaches was evident. Have you and Mom discussed relocation options? I asked, turning toward practical next steps. We've started exploring possibilities, he confirmed. The most viable approaches involve moving closer to either you or Vanessa, finding something modest but comfortable, and rebuilding with adjusted expectations. The mention of moving closer to family members represented another significant shift. Throughout my adult life, geographical distance from my parents had provided necessary emotional space for developing my identity beyond their expectations and judgments. The prospect of increased proximity created both opportunity and challenge, potential for more authentic connection alongside risk of reverting to established patterns. What are your thoughts about that possibility? My father asked, demonstrating unusual sensitivity to my perspective. We wouldn't want to impose or complicate your life further. I appreciate you asking, I said, genuinely moved by this consideration. I think proximity could work if we maintain clear boundaries and continue building healthier communication patterns. But it needs further discussion, with Mom as well, and with an understanding that my professional obligations limit my availability. Our conversation continued, addressing practical considerations while acknowledging emotional complexities. Throughout the exchange, I noted my father's increasing comfort with direct discussion of feelings and relationships, territory he had traditionally navigated awkwardly, if at all. Whether from necessity or genuine growth, he was demonstrating capacity for more authentic engagement than our previous interactions had suggested possible. Wednesday brought focus back to professional responsibilities as I prepared for a critical client presentation while monitoring developments in my parents' situation. By Thursday, preliminary settlement discussions between Parkview, my father, and Lawrence Keller had established general parameters for potential resolution: full cooperation with internal and regulatory investigations, restitution of approximately $785,000, 90% of identified misappropriated funds, and voluntary surrender of securities licenses in exchange for Parkview declining criminal referral. The terms were appropriately serious while offering path forward that avoided worst-case scenarios. My father would face significant financial consequences and permanent professional limitations, but potential criminal prosecution and public disgrace might be averted through this approach. Thursday evening, I received a call from my mother, an increasingly common occurrence as our communication patterns evolved beyond the distant, formal exchanges that had characterized our relationship for years. "We've been meeting with real estate agents," she said after brief pleasantries, "looking at options for when we sell the house. It's humbling." The simple acknowledgement of changed circumstances without dramatic lamentation signaled continuing adjustment to their new reality. "What areas are you considering?" I asked. "We've focused on suburbs around Chicago," she replied, surprising me with the directness of their planning. "Charles feels it would be good to be near you, given your understanding of the financial aspects of our situation. And She hesitated uncharacteristically. "I would like the opportunity to develop a different kind of relationship with you, if that's something you might be open to." The tentative vulnerability in this request contrasted sharply with her previous approach to our relationship, which had prioritized performance and evaluation over authentic connection. While wary of premature conclusions about lasting change, I recognized the courage required for this emotional disclosure from someone who had maintained rigid control over self-presentation throughout her life. "I think that's possible," I said carefully. "It would require continued effort from both of us. Establishing new patterns isn't simple after decades of established dynamics." "I understand that," she acknowledged. "And I recognize that I bear primary responsibility for the problematic patterns between us. Your father has helped me see how my insecurities and unfulfilled aspirations created impossible standards that prevented me from appreciating who you actually are, rather than who I thought you should be." This level of self-awareness and responsibility represented unprecedented territory in our relationship. Throughout my life, my mother had maintained careful distance from introspection or accountability regarding her impact on others, particularly her daughters. This direct acknowledgement of her role in our dysfunctional dynamics offered potential foundation for something genuinely new between us. "That means a lot to hear," I said, allowing authentic emotion to enter my voice. "I've spent years trying to earn approval that seemed perpetually out of reach, no matter what I achieved." "I know," she said quietly. "I've been thinking about something you said last week, about how financial mistakes don't define a person's entire worth. I'm beginning to understand that the same principle applies to other kinds of mistakes, including how I've approached motherhood at times." The parallel she drew between my father's financial misconduct and her own relational failures demonstrated evolving perspective beyond immediate crisis management. Whether this insight would translate into sustained behavioral change remained uncertain, but its emergence created space for cautious optimism about future possibilities. Our conversation continued, addressing both practical relocation considerations and deeper relational dynamics with unusual directness. By its conclusion, tentative plans had formed for my parents to visit Chicago the following weekend to explore potential neighborhoods and continue discussions about rebuilding both financial stability and family relationships. Friday morning brought additional development as Lawrence Keller called to report progress in settlement negotiations with Parkview. "Their legal team has responded favorably to our proposal," he explained. "They've indicated willingness to structure restitution as an installment arrangement following initial payment from liquidated assets, which would preserve minimal resources for your parents' transition." This approach aligned with the financial strategy I'd been developing, creating sustainable path forward that balanced appropriate consequences with practical necessity. While my father's professional career was effectively over, and their lifestyle would require dramatic adjustment, the emerging framework offered possibility for dignified transition, rather than complete devastation. As Friday afternoon transitioned to evening, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary developments of the past 2 weeks while preparing for a rare weekend without either client obligations or family crisis management. The trajectory from Vanessa's wedding, where I'd been deemed worthless by my mother, to my current central role in navigating family reconstruction represented a transformation I couldn't have anticipated. Yet the most significant shifts had occurred not in practical circumstances but in relational dynamics. My father had moved from distant provider, maintaining careful emotional barriers, to vulnerable human acknowledging mistakes and expressing genuine appreciation for my capabilities. My mother had begun transitioning from critical evaluator measuring against impossible standards to someone cautiously exploring authentic connection based on acceptance rather than performance. These changes didn't erase decades of painful history or guarantee sustainable transformation. The practical challenges ahead remained substantial, requiring consistent effort and adjusted expectations from everyone involved. The potential for reversion to established patterns during inevitable periods of stress created realistic caution about overly optimistic projections. Yet within these uncertainties existed genuine possibility for something I had effectively abandoned hope for years earlier: family relationships characterized by mutual respect, appropriate boundaries, and authentic connection rather than performance. And evaluation. The crisis that had revealed the hollow foundation beneath carefully maintained appearances had simultaneously created opportunity for building something more substantial in its place. As I stood at my living room window overlooking Chicago's skyline illuminated against the evening sky, I recognized that the coming months would involve continued navigation of complex territory, supporting my parents through necessary consequences, while maintaining appropriate professional and personal boundaries. The path would include setbacks alongside progress, moments of frustration alongside breakthrough connections. But for perhaps the first time in my adult life, I felt genuine hope about my family's capacity for growth beyond limiting patterns. Not despite the current crisis, but because of how it had shattered pretenses and created space for authenticity. The daughter once deemed worthless for prioritizing professional accomplishment over conventional expectations had become essential not just for practical crisis management, but for modeling the integrity, resilience, and balanced perspective that might guide collective reconstruction. The irony wasn't lost on me, but neither was it the point. What mattered wasn't vindication or role reversal, but the potential emergence of relationships based on who we actually were rather than who we pretended to be or thought we should become. Within that authentic territory, something genuinely valuable might develop. Not perfect or painless, but real in ways that carefully maintained appearances could never achieve. That possibility alone made the difficult journey worthwhile. The suburban Chicago neighborhood of Evanston presented a stark contrast to Greenwich's manicured estates and carefully maintained exclusivity. Tree-lined streets featured diverse architectural styles ranging from Victorian houses to mid-century modern designs, creating an eclectic but welcoming atmosphere. As I guided my parents through the area that Saturday morning, I observed their reactions with professional detachment layered over personal investment. "It's quite different," my mother observed, her neutral tone masking whatever judgment might lie beneath. We had just finished touring a modest 3-bedroom townhouse, approximately 1/3 the size of their Greenwich home but well-maintained, with updated appliances and a small garden patio. Northwestern University is nearby, I noted, providing context beyond physical characteristics. There's a vibrant intellectual community, good restaurants within walking distance, and excellent public transportation for accessing downtown Chicago. My father nodded, seeming to appreciate these practical considerations. The price point is certainly appropriate for our adjusted circumstances. What are property taxes compared to Connecticut? Significantly lower, I confirmed. About 40% of what you're currently paying, with better public services. We continued our exploration, visiting 3 additional properties that aligned with their revised financial parameters. Throughout the morning, I maintained careful balance between providing relevant information and allowing them space to form their own impressions. This approach reflected the evolving boundaries in our relationship: supportive without controlling, involved without intrusive. The real estate agent, a woman approximately my mother's age who specialized in relocation services, demonstrated similar sensitivity. Many of my clients are downsizing from larger suburban homes, she explained over lunch at a local cafe. It's an adjustment, certainly, but most discover unexpected benefits beyond financial considerations: less maintenance, walkable neighborhoods, more diverse communities. Do you work with many people our age who are starting over? My mother asked, the question revealing vulnerability beneath her composed exterior. The agent considered her response thoughtfully. I wouldn't call it starting over so much as redirecting. Many of my clients in their 60s and 70s are making intentional changes, reducing physical and financial burdens to focus on what matters most at this stage of life. That's a generous reframing, my father observed with a small smile. In our case, the change wasn't exactly intentional. Perhaps not in its timing or specific circumstances, the agent acknowledged, but you're approaching it with intention. Now, that's what ultimately matters. This perspective, focusing on current choices rather than past mistakes, aligned with the approach I'd been encouraging my parents to adopt. The circumstances forcing their relocation were unquestionably serious, involving significant professional misconduct and appropriate consequences. Yet within those constraints, space remained for thoughtful decisions about rebuilding with adjusted expectations and priorities. As we parted with the agent after scheduling additional viewings for Sunday, my mother surprised me by suggesting, "We visit the lakeshore. I'd like to see what draws you to Chicago beyond professional opportunities," she said. "We've visited you several times over the years, but never really experienced the city through your eyes." This expression of interest in my perspective represented significant departure from our traditional interactions, which had typically centered on her expectations and assessments, rather than genuine curiosity about my experience. Whether motivated by necessity or authentic growth, the shift created opening for different kind of exchange between us. Lake Michigan is one of my favorite aspects of living here, I acknowledged as we found parking near Northwestern University's campus. Especially in contrast to the intensity of corporate work, having this natural boundary at the edge of the city provides both physical and psychological space. We walked along the shore path, the October afternoon offering perfect temperature with slight breeze off the water. Other visitors populated the area without creating crowding. Families with young children, university students reading on blankets, elderly couples walking at measured pace. "It reminds me somewhat of the Connecticut shore," my mother observed, after several minutes of quiet observation, though with fresher perspective, less encumbered by tradition and exclusivity. The comparison captured something essential about Chicago's appeal compared to the East Coast environments where I'd grown up and attended college. "That's insightful," I said, genuinely impressed by her perception. The openness was part of what attracted me initially. Fewer predetermined paths, more possibility for defining success on my own terms. My father, who had been walking slightly ahead of us, turned with thoughtful expression. "I wonder if we should have encouraged that perspective more in both you girls. So much of our parenting involved preparing you for very specific definitions of achievement. The right schools, connections, careers. Perhaps we limited your exploration unnecessarily." This level of reflective self-assessment from my father was unprecedented in my experience. Throughout my childhood and young adulthood, he had maintained unwavering commitment to conventional metrics of success: academic performance, prestigious institutions, professional advancement along established pathways. This questioning of fundamental assumptions suggested significant evolution beyond crisis management, toward genuine reconsideration of core values. "It's never too late to adopt different perspectives," I offered carefully. That's essentially what I do professionally. Help organizations recognize when established patterns have become unsustainable and develop new approaches that preserve what's valuable while discarding what isn't working. Corporate rehabilitation. Applied to family dynamics, my mother observed with unexpected humor. Is that what you're doing with us, Rachel? Professional restructuring with personal stakes? The question contained no detectable defensiveness, only genuine curiosity, and perhaps slight amusement at the parallel. There are similarities, I acknowledged. Identifying unsustainable patterns, developing realistic assessment of available resources, creating strategic plan for transition toward more viable future. The emotional dimensions are obviously more complex. And the stakes higher, my father added quietly. We continued walking, the conversation shifting toward practical considerations about their potential relocation, proximity to medical facilities, community resources, transportation options. Throughout the exchange, I noted subtle but significant changes in our interaction patterns. My parents asked genuine questions about my perspective, rather than asserting predetermined conclusions. I offered input without expectation of either automatic acceptance or reflexive dismissal. The dynamic felt more balanced than any previous exchange in my adult memory. After dinner at a neighborhood restaurant near my condo, we returned to discussion of their financial situation. The preliminary settlement framework with Parkview was progressing toward formal agreement, with final terms likely to be established within the coming week. Lawrence Keller had negotiated terms that balanced appropriate consequences with practical viability, substantial financial restitution, and permanent professional restrictions for my father, but structured to allow minimal resources for rebuilding rather than complete devastation. I've been developing projections based on the settlement parameters, I explained, opening my laptop to display spreadsheets I'd prepared. Assuming sale of the Greenwich house at current market valuation, liquidation of non-protected assets, and structured payment schedule for remaining restitution, you should have approximately $320,000 to establish new living arrangements. My father studied the figures with professional assessment despite their personal implications. Enough for modest housing purchase in the areas we're considering, with remaining funds for basic living expenses during transition. Significantly different from our previous situation, but workable. What about ongoing income? My mother asked, demonstrating practical engagement I might not have expected from someone who had traditionally delegated financial matters entirely to my father. Charles won't be able to work in finance again. I've been researching options, my father said, surprising me with this proactive approach. My securities licenses will be revoked, but my MBA and financial knowledge remain valuable in different contexts. Teaching positions at community colleges, consulting on non-securities financial matters, financial literacy programs for underserved communities, all represent viable possibilities. This exploration of alternative applications for his expertise suggested healthy adaptation rather than passive acceptance of circumstances. While his misconduct had appropriately ended his career in securities management, his underlying knowledge and experience retained potential value in contexts where they could benefit others without risk of similar ethical breaches. Those sound like promising directions, I affirmed, and they align with the perspective shift we discussed earlier, focusing on contribution rather than status or compensation. It's strange, my mother reflected, how quickly priorities can change when circumstances force reassessment. 6 months ago, I would have considered these options beneath consideration. Now they seem not just necessary but potentially meaningful, in ways our previous life wasn't. This insight reflected continuing evolution in her perspective beyond immediate crisis response. Throughout my life, my mother had maintained rigid adherence to external metrics of success, prestigious addresses, social connections, visible prosperity. Her willingness to reconsider these priorities as potentially empty or even detrimental represented significant shift toward more authentic values assessment. "What about you, Mom?" I asked carefully. "Have you thought about what your own activities might look like in this new chapter?" The question addressed dimension of their transition that had received less explicit attention. My mother's identity beyond supporting my father's career and maintaining appropriate social presence. Throughout their marriage, her professional capabilities had remained largely unexpressed beyond volunteer committee work carefully selected for status rather than impact. "I've been considering that," she said, surprising me with evidence of independent reflection. "My art history degree has gathered dust for decades while I focused on being Charles Morgan's wife and Vanessa and Rachel's mother. But I've always loved teaching, even if I limited it to volunteer docent work at the museum." "Evanston has excellent museums and cultural institutions," I noted, encouraging this direction. "Northwestern's art department, the Block Museum, multiple community arts organizations." "I've already researched volunteer opportunities," she confirmed, "and potentially part-time paid positions that would both provide some income and create structured engagement with community. It wouldn't replace what we had financially, but it might offer different kind of satisfaction." This proactive exploration of possibilities aligned with the reconstruction approach I'd been subtly encouraging, acknowledging irreversible changes while identifying opportunities within new constraints. Rather than clinging to impossible restoration of previous circumstances, both my parents seemed increasingly oriented toward building something different but potentially more authentic. As evening progressed, our conversation shifted toward family matters beyond immediate practical concerns. Vanessa had scheduled visit the following weekend, creating opportunity for collective discussion about supporting each other through transition while maintaining appropriate boundaries. My sister's natural tendency toward emotional caretaking required particular attention to prevent unhealthy sacrifice of her own priorities during this family reconstruction. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.